Jeff Marshall talking about the Ten Commandments, and Carrie addressing chapters 19 and 20. Last week, we now go into a continuing discussion of laws. And this is where it gets, in some ways, kind of tedious. You know, when you're thinking about what laws are, we said we're going to study, California laws, and you sit there and you look at the book. How would that get you excited? Probably not too excited. You figure there'd be a lot of talk in there that's not really easy to understand, and so you have to kind of parse it in some way. And that's kind of the way it is with this. We don't understand the background to all the things, all these laws, these various laws that were significant for the people. And what I'd like to ask you right now is we look at this one little section where we deal with different laws that would guide them. What's the purpose of law anyway? Just step outside the whole idea of the Bible is law and laws in the Bible. But why do we have laws? So we don't have chaos. Okay, so we don't have chaos. Chaos meaning, what do you mean by that? That's a lack of order is chaos. Yeah, unruly behavior or order, as you say, Janine. What else? Yeah, James.
In the Old Testament, certain times they would say there was no, I forgot what, but each man did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah, when there's no laws. By the way, James hasn't been here in a while, and he's here, so we're glad to see him back with us after his battle with COVID. So the lawlessness part of it, or they do what's right in their own eyes, I think that kind of helps me and you to understand that that's what one of the things that laws do. Yeah, Jessica?
Well, with God transit, it's trying to put projecting a nomadic people group into
Okay.
a nation.
Okay.
Because a nomadic people group just kind of follows whatever customs and
Yeah.
areas they have.
Yeah.
As a nation, they're going to have their own set of rules
Right.
that other nations can follow. So that's what's going to differentiate them now.
But this would give them some organization, I think, as a still nomadic people. Wouldn't you say at this stage they still... Right, okay. So what else? What else about laws and why we need them, why they're good? I mean, it's certainly been a subject of consideration, when we talk about the police department and don't fund the police and all those things, we generally look at that and say, well, there's a problem when you don't do that because we need something to handle the chaos that may come as a result of that. What else? Yeah, Vance? Right. Yeah. Now, when you go through chapter 21 and 22, I mean, there's a lot of laws here, and some of them are talking about similarly, they're talking about the things right next to them, but sometimes they're not. And so I think that's the part of it that causes us to not get real excited when we're looking at this. So why would we not maybe give attention to this section here? We just kind of blaze over on. Well, we've already said that, at least I said, because laws can sometimes be tedious. What else, though? This is kind of more from a spiritual point of view. Yeah?
These laws were put to bed with the new covenant.
Okay.
So they don't really pertain.
Okay, so we get here, and it kind of overwhelms us a little bit, and we go, oh, well, this is just part of Moses' law, and so why should we worry about it? And, I mean, I think that's, I don't say that's not reasonable to do that, but still it helps us to understand, what God considers to be useful to a community. And I think that's a really good thing for us to know. Any other comments about that, just that concept of the significance and the importance of law? Yeah.
Romans 13 tells us that laws are necessary to protect the innocent
Right.
and to punish the criminal.
Okay. And that's pretty fundamental, isn't it? Yeah, it's to protect the innocent and to make the person who breaks the law serve in some way some sort of punishment or whatever it is that is required when he breaks the law or she breaks the law. All right, now, so we look at some of these things, and again, Somebody say something? Oh, is that?
I was just gonna say.
Oh, okay.
A lot of the laws that were put in force years ago, even in this country.
Yeah,
Were based upon a lot of
true.
thoughts that were presented to us through the Old Testament covenant
Right.
and the New Testament. From that standpoint, we see that we moved eons away from that. Just an
Yeah.
example, with one who broke into your house, you had the right to kill him in your access.
Yeah.
21st chapter, but you can't do that in today's world.
Yeah.
You're the one that's going to go to jail.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, some states have it to where if the person's on your property, you can do that. But you are, yeah, that's true. I think laws are generally, when I think about, here these people are all out in this situation where they're wandering around, they're organized, obviously. But laws, when you look at them as value from old and new, is that what we're talking about here is how people treat other people. And when you you think about the fundamental law, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, that's what most of these are about. And it just shows you how you can break it down. And I think that's one of the things that, even though we may look at modern law books and find them to be, overwhelming in detail, I mean, there's enough detail here to kind of make it a little bit difficult for me to sort of wade through it and figure out, well, how did you resolve all that? How was it, if you read in here how these things were resolved, there was one facet of community that's there that's supposed to help people to understand who actually violated law. And it kind of goes back to Moses. What did Moses do when his father-in-law came and told him, you're just being overwhelmed by all this that's going on within your particular sphere. And so what did he do? What did Moses do? Yeah, he provided judges or elders or overseers in one way or another, and so they would help make sure that the law was obeyed. So I think law is a good thing. And so I think, for me anyway, because of certain theological approaches to the Bible, the word law or the idea of law is kind of a dirty word. And I mean, obviously, if you're going to have something to obey, which we're certainly told to obey, that it certainly also implies that there are going to be laws that you obey. So why laws are a bad thing, it is because of a particular theological approach to it that says, we're saved by grace and not by the obedience of law. And so that makes the whole thing something that makes it so we're not really interested in understanding why we have laws in the first place. Yes, Richard?
Unique that we see in 1 John where there is no law, there is no sin.
Right.
In relationship to that, I think it can be used along with this as well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. We need to know what's right and what's wrong. And particularly in this setting, when they're wandering in the wilderness, and they're not in their land yet. I mean, it's still going to be important once they get in their land. But the first set of laws is about slavery. And I think that's, something, obviously, when we start thinking about issues that relate to today and the origin of slavery and what slavery means. The slavery that we're reading about here is not exactly the, what some people call the Caribbean model. And that is the one where people are abused more so and treated like property. And I think, you might draw the conclusion that that's true here, but the laws there for slavery are related to how a person can become a slave. Anyone give much thought to that? How a person in this area a person could become a slave? In the way most of us think, you're just a part of a certain race or cultural, ethnic group, whatever it may be, and then you can just be bought and sold. That's not what this was like. Okay, Dana says, isn't it more like servitude? I think the idea that you're maybe working because you have certain responsibilities that you have. And I think that comes out here, and it becomes pretty clear that that's a part of it. You can become a slave when you have a debt. You're overwhelmed with debt. So you're in poverty, you're in debt, or you can become a slave as a result of committing a crime. Now, in the case of what's going on here, if you happen to do something to hurt a community or a person, and you can't provide restitution, well, then that would be a way that you might become a slave for that person. That person would now have you as their servant until the debt was paid. So, can you see the difference between this? Because the Bible talks about slavery. So we can't just pretend like it's not there, or someone say, well, see, it talks about slavery, so it must be an evil book. Well, in this community here, as it was a part of allowing people to pay back things, to pay for things that they've done, debts, whatever it was. They could become someone's slave. And so with that in mind, the question was, I said, how would you describe the relationship between a Hebrew slave and a Hebrew master? And then I asked you to look at another passage. I'm trying to help us to try to understand what is it that made this relationship what it was. Anybody try to answer that question? I mean, I know I just got that out there yesterday, and you looked at them today, so I wouldn't expect that anybody had a real deep look at them. But let's go ahead and follow it along. It says, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years. Now, this was something just, yeah, go ahead, Larry.
You were asking that the difference of the Hebrew.
Yeah.
I look at it the same way that I look at something that will come up a little bit later in terms of marriage. And that is, he asked, Moses was allowed them to have a bill of divorcement.
Right.
In my view, to protect women.
Right.
I think what you see here is he doesn't condone, anywhere in the scripture condone slavery, but what he does is he puts a restriction on the ownership and a responsibility upon the slave, so that each one will have certain criteria, certain things that they have to do, that neither one can really take advantage of.
Right. And so the way we traditionally look at slavery in our country is that it's kind of a one-sided deal, isn't it, in favor of the master. Okay, that's a good point. What else? Yes, Tammy?
When I read he doesn't like slavery, but he wants to love and serve
Yeah.
the
Yeah, when we're talking about slavery, we have to understand what we've established here. Someone is poor. A lot of times the way we've approached poverty is we say we don't have them go to work for anybody or any particular organization per se. We just give them money. And, they didn't have social systems set up that way. Poor people had to be taken care of in some way. They certainly would have been by free will offerings from time to time, but this was a way, and like Larry was saying, it creates an attitude of respect toward one another. So that's the kind of slavery. So when we're talking about, God doesn't hate this kind of slavery. Okay, it's the kind of slavery that we're used to talking about. Go ahead, Tammy.
Well, after the 6 years,
Sure.
you have to release them
Right.
with enough money.
Yeah, don't get ahead of us here. We'll just go ahead and read that. But yes, there was a 7-year limit. Okay, and then there were some things that went along with it in terms of responsibility. This is where I'm trying to show the difference between the slavery you and I have in our minds versus the slavery we read about here. So he says, if he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. So he comes in, he has someone who's with him, well, then he goes out with her. Now, it's going to be something different that's going to happen. If he gets a wife while he's there, then the master has the right to this woman. And they can still work this out if they still want to be together. So let's kind of go into what Tammy's talking about. It says, if this master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. Does anybody know if the relationship between these ones that are left behind would fall under the category of the 7-year rule, the Jubilee rule? Anybody? I don't know if they actually are or not. I got the sense that they would then have to stay unless some other arrangement was made. So it says, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man. So he's got some things that he enjoys, and that is his family and his children. And so he's thinking, this is the arrangement. The arrangement is, I will have my children and my family. This all happened with the support of my master in this relationship where I went in because I was poor, did something bad, whatever it may have been. So he says, and then his master shall bring him to God, and then he shall bring him up to the door or the doorpost. Now, I don't know, there hasn't been a whole lot of hammering on the doorpost, to create a hole in one's ear. There's a lot of different ideas about where this came from and where it originates. So if you're interested in it, you can certainly look that up and try to maybe draw some conclusion. But anyway, it was to signify what? What does it say in verse 6? What was it all about? It says, his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. In other words, this guy likes where he is. He has a good relationship in this business of family, if you will, as it relates to someone who puts people to work as a result of the circumstances in which they're in. And then it says in verse 7, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves go. And of course, that's something we're not particularly used to in terms of our understanding of slavery. But that's a particular aspect of it in those days. You might want to talk about your women, Larry. The reason the law for putting away someone for divorcement. The purpose of that was to protect the woman. Yeah.
Now I'm going to divorce you.
Right.
I've had my fling, now I'm going to bring it back.
Sure, right. And of course, the general rule here is that the woman is in a situation here, she's by herself, and she can be protected. Being out there by herself was a situation that was not going to be very good for her. So let's understand that what we're talking about is that when we're seeing these particular laws, and I don't know if I want to keep going into this one a whole lot more unless anybody else has any more ideas about what we're discussing here, and I can go on to the next question. Anybody else? I'm hoping I have. I have a pile over here. And anything that's below me on a floor is not one of my favorite things to have to go after. Every time I bend over, I tend to get dizzy. And some other people are like that. Bob, where's Bob French? Is he in there? Back here somewhere? Yeah. Bob, you've kind of gotten out of your getting dizzy thing, haven't you? Yeah. So there's hope. For me, I like to look at it that way, but Judy says it's an ear problem, and so, you're going to be stuck with it unless something happens in there. So, okay. I ask you to consider other information about this relationship found in Deuteronomy 15. Understand that we're talking about a situation where people are living in I think a certainly relatively nomadic way. I mean, the way they're being described are people who go out and they roam around. And so why would these laws need to be a little bit more strict? I mean, we look at these, we live in a culture that's generally free and safe so far. But it wasn't that way here. And so these were about protecting people. All right, so let's look at the Deuteronomy passage, Deuteronomy chapter 15, because I think it gives me a little bit more insight to the goodness and the care being provided for these people. Deuteronomy 15, chapter 12, it says, if your kinsman, a Hebrew man or a woman, is sold to you, then he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall set him free. So there's that principle that's put out there. Now, why is that rule there, do you think? We're not told, but why do you think it's there? Say the first part of it again, Carol.
It was the year of Jubilee,
Right.
7th year, and they were to release all debts if you owed
Okay.
somebody or someone owed you.
Okay, and it's important to understand that people who were slaves were also recipients of that.
Right.
So again, that's where it's important for us to understand that. Okay, it says in verse 13, when you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. Now this goes back to, Tammy was raising this point a while ago, that even when he goes, it's not like he just kicks him out. And that causes me to believe that, this is one of those things that's also evidentiary of the idea of taking care of other people and providing for them. He says, you shall furnish him liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your wine vat, and you shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. Now, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I mean, it helps us to understand that when this guy goes, he doesn't go without still serving from the benefit of being a part of the family. So that, to me, suggests a certain attitude of benevolence toward this individual. He's been here, he's worked hard, and so he deserves to get something as a result of that. This is not like the kind of thing we call slavery these days. All right, and so, and there's a reason for this. And this shows up also over in the book of Exodus, and that's what we read in verse 15. Mitch, could you read verse 15 of chapter 15, Deuteronomy? Okay, there's another place where we're going to run into it. You do something because God is gracious. And if God is gracious, what should you be? You should be gracious too. And so, why is this there? Why does this little proverb, if you will, show up a few times when we're talking about how you treat other people? Why would this be something so important to them? Or should be something important to them? To remember. Remember how they're being told you need to remember what happened when you were in Egypt. And not just because it was a bad time for everybody, but what you learned there. What you learned there. And so when you have people who are down and out around you, to overly simplify it, I suppose, and you certainly were feeling that way when you were there in Egypt, so shouldn't you treat other people in a way to where you're showing appreciation for them? Remember when you were in Egypt and you didn't feel so appreciated. Obviously they were able to live in houses and things like that, but nevertheless, it was considered to be something that was wrong. Go ahead, Larry.
In a perfect world, wouldn't it be that he could say something like that, and we would all remember it and do it? But we don't live in a perfect world.
Yeah.
And so this is where these laws come in. And to me, it's really important to kind of remember, God doesn't condone all of this kind of action.
Right.
What he's doing is he's preventing people and protecting people.
Right.
Preventing people from abusing the process.
Yeah.
If they're willing to follow the law.
Yeah, and I think you're right when we say, look at what it says here. This is not because everybody's going to turn into Smiley, we'll just do everything and treat everybody in the right way. It's because there has to be some umbrella of order here, and one good way to have that is to remember what it was like in Egypt. That's just one of those things. It doesn't solve everything for you, but remember, particularly in these situations where you have people over which you have under control. Now, the master-servant relationship in the New Testament, what are masters told in that environment? Do they have no responsibility and it's the servant who has all the responsibility? No. They have the responsibility to show love and care for the people who are under them. And they're also a part of this idea of submission and subjection. We all submit to one another, subject ourselves to one another. But notice again, in verse 16, it says, "It shall come about if he says to you, I will not go out from you." Of course, this is that option now that's available. And the boss, or whatever you want to call him, is amenable to it. Amenable, excuse me. "Then you shall take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door. And he shall be then your servant forever. Also, you also shall do likewise to your maidservant." So this is going to be proof not only for the person, but it's also showing the demonstration of the master, how he is supposed to now treat this person. This is a person who belongs here all the time. This is a choice that they have made. So what do you think now about what we've read here? I mean, I guess I've already tried to draw my own conclusions, but, when we're talking about slavery, does it sound, again, like anything? I don't want to say like anything, but can you see a distinction here and a difference? Because really, and I think, let's go back to Larry's point about these all laws are there to protect people. The laws for the master and the slave are also to protect people. Yeah, Dave?
Even Abraham, back before he had his sons, one of his servants was going to inherit everything he had.
Yeah.
They had rights.
Yeah, Dave was talking about Abraham's servant, and when they weren't real hopeful about getting a son, it was the way it would be done. His most elder servant would be able to have whatever it was that he was going to be leaving behind. So, as Dave says, they have rights. Yeah, Rich?
He reminds the Hebrews how they were treated in
Right,
relationship to that, trying to deal with their slaves.
right, right. And, I mean, in a kind of simplistic kind of way, you're saying to them, you might want to push people around. You might want to take advantage of them. I mean, all of those things related to how you treat people, what he's hoping in this imperfect world is that this is going to affect their way of looking at things all the time. It's like remembering that I'm maybe not all that great and all that wonderful in the world. I got to understand that I'm just who I am and I'm not that special. That's kind of part of that as well. And treat people in that way. Okay, let's get on down to question 2. It says, according to 21:12, list the offenses that are punishable by death. And I'm not saying these are all of them, but the ones that are listed here. I mean, there are different accounts of these things. Leviticus sometimes is a little different from this, and a little different from Deuteronomy. What I have on my list here is if you hit a man and he dies, then that's punishable by death. But there are exceptions to this. This sounds just like what we're used to seeing in the way our laws work. You may kill someone, but there's a lot of different levels of that, isn't there? And so you strike a man and he dies, and look at verse 12 through 14. If you have that, Exodus 21, I'm away from there. Exodus 21, verses 12 through 14.
Whoever strikes someone so that he dies must surely be put to death. But if he does not do it with premeditation, but it happens by accident, then I will appoint for you a place where he may plead. But if a man willfully attacks his neighbor to kill him suddenly, you will take him even from my altar that he may die.
Okay, now, we don't have capital punishment. Well, do we have capital punishment in California? Technically, do we still have it? I don't think so. It floated around. Okay, well, anyway. Well, obviously, in this particular situation, there were things that were meant to be capital offenses. Now, but there were different ways if something happened. If for instance, if you killed someone, it was an accident, then that was going to be different, wasn't it? There are going to be different ways of looking at it. But the things that I think are interesting to me is what God considers as being really important here. If we're going to treat people right and people are going to be feeling protected in the society in which they live. If you kill a parent, that was also something that was punishable by death. Now, why does that not surprise you based on the Ten Commandments? Yeah, right. And you're also not supposed to speak bad things about them. And so if you kill them, it kind of makes sense to us that that's going to be punishable by death. Now, again, in the culture in which we live, generally speaking, the reason why it's rare for a crime to be so bad in places where they still have capital punishment and use it. I mean, it's got to be very, very convincing, isn't it, in order for it to be carried out. But here it gives you some understanding that helps us to understand what makes a good society. Now, the interesting one is the one I have listed as number 4. And that's the one that, for the most part, doesn't make sense. What is it? In our society. Kidnapping, okay, but still, people see that as very serious. Go ahead, Dalton. Yeah, and that's, does that have striking? I thought it was cursing. Okay, all right. So let's go back. I think we understand the striking aspect of it, the dishonorable nature of that. But even in this society, now you kind of wonder about some of these things. There are a lot of laws that I just don't think they enforced. I mean, I think it's very clear to me that they weren't at times. I mean, there were a lot of laws they didn't obey, certainly as relates to worship to God. And I think in the culture itself, there would have been things they just didn't hold people to it. Now, I'm thinking for the most part, this would be something that would be considerably held high. But nevertheless, if you curse your father and mother, now how is that the difference between honor your father and mother? Cursing is saying bad things about someone. Essentially, that's a very simple way of looking at it. But what do you think? Because, do we think that, this idea of honoring parents is, really without limitation? Because most of us think that it probably has limitations. My parents don't treat me correctly, therefore, I have the right to treat them in a certain way. Now, they don't necessarily have the they don't have the right to treat you poorly, but in God's world, that doesn't give me the right to talk to them in a certain way. Does that make sense? Would you say that anybody who has parents that are not fit for doing what they're doing, that they're still supposed to be treated in a way that, or they can be treated with a way that shows disrespect to them? Christina and then Dana.
So, God gave you to your parents. He knew who they were.
Right.
He knew how that was going to work out. There was a reason He put you there.
Right.
So, to curse them, you're basically cursing God, because it was God's ultimate decision on how that was going to be.
Yeah.
So, you may have a very hard time
Yeah.
honoring them and not saying disrespectful things about them.
Well, yeah.
But you can find ways to not do it. Like, don't talk about them. Just move on
Yeah.
with your life once you're of age.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of parental abuse by children. I mean, it's a well-known thing in social structures. And again, ideally, it shouldn't be that way. Because if people are honoring their father and their mother, then they're going to be watchful as to how they treat them. It's kind of the same way with the government. You're told not to curse your leader. And of course, do the kind of things which are respectful. And that's not a part of what's in here, but still the principle is still the same. There are certain institutions that God seems to want to be respected. The one that's so important here is that between a parent and a child. So, when I look down through the rest of this, I'm looking for the one that talks about a woman being... Oh, here it is, verse 22. If men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband and maybe demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. Okay, something terrible has happened, and the child is not harmed, per se. But if there is any further injury, then you shall have a point as a penalty of life for life, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. That's a general principle. It's all about making things equal. It's not saying here that if someone comes up and pokes my eye out, then I can turn around and poke their eye out. It's just there's a certain equality that must go on, particularly with the idea of restitution. So I asked the question, I said, do you think that particular principle that's stated there, do you think that could in any way be related to the idea of abortion? Okay, in what way?
Justice would be if the woman killed her child on purpose,
Yeah.
then she's guilty of murder.
Yeah, I think generally speaking in this culture it's unthinkable that it would be done that way. But, I mean, if the woman has child, now in our culture, the way it's looked at is that, okay, it belongs to the woman, she can do what she wants with it. Well, that's not the way it was in God's world. It's important to understand that. Go ahead, Mitch.
That kind of penalty is here for an unintended consequence of men struggling. How much more would it be if it was an intended consequence?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's kind of related to the idea of abortion. I mean, you actually choose intended action on the baby that's in the womb. Now, again, I don't think this answers every question about it, but what I am wanting us to understand that it helps us to understand the principle of it. That, it's in a womb, it's to be treated with respect, and if it's not treated with respect, well then that's not acceptable to God. So I think it's important to think about that when we're addressing this subject of abortion, because I think for the most part the way it's considered to be viewed today, it's an all woman's issue in that she can do what she wants, and that being true, then there's not anything, as they say, people, particularly men, don't have any right to give any insight into what that may be. Go ahead, Justin, quick point before we go on.
Yeah, over and over again in Scripture, children are talked about as a blessing. And
Sure.
and
That's another angle.
them together
Yeah,
in the
sure.
womb and everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's many of the atrocities that are even brought back against the children of Israel at some point in time.
Sure.
They sacrificed.
They did sacrifice their children. Yeah, so there's, but
It's unthinkable to me
but
and unrecognized.
and I agree with you. I'm just saying that there's just a lot of different angles, I think, where you could look at this and then draw some conclusions. This is just one of them right here. And so it gives more firepower to that. Yeah, Travis? Oh, Carrie, oh. Your arm looked like it was connected to Travis. Yeah, well, that's true.
What's interesting is the semantics that are used. When we talk about a woman who is pregnant, she has a child in the womb.
Yeah.
The fact that it's used for a child.
Yeah. Yeah, and we know that, years and years ago that people fought that tooth and nail about it being a child inside, and the more we found out about things, the more we found out that it is about certainly by about 6 weeks, it's taken on everything that's adult, or not adult, but human. Go ahead, Rich.
I was just going to say real quickly, verse 23 says a life for a life.
Right.
God recognizes the unborn child as living.
It would be a part of that way of looking at things, that there needs to be respect, obviously, and guys are giving some good reasons for that. Let's see, the question that I have next, and we're obviously not going to finish these. Question 4, do you understand the laws that we're reading so far as to be fair? And let's look at verse 21, verse 28, and 29. That's probably going to get pretty close to the end. It says, If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. Now, I'm using this setting here for asking about, well, do you think these things sound fair? We've been talking about a lot of different things. And so there are a lot of times when we look at the things God does and we go, boy, that doesn't seem right to me. Remember how we talked sometime about when Saul was called to go destroy the Amalekites? And it seems like, whoa, what's the deal with the Amalekites? They have never done anything wrong. Of course, if you do some investigating, some study, you find out they'd done some horrible things to these people that God had said they are not going to, they're not going to continue to exist as a nation. All right, so we're talking about the ox goring. And in verse 29 it says, if however an ox was previously in the habit of goring and its owner has been warned, yet he does not confine it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. All right, now, important for us to understand. These are things that are part of the law of Moses. As already been pointed out, we do not live under the law of Moses, but we can gain some sort of understanding about God's fairness. Now, so I ask you to draw some sort of conclusion that you've heard about the things we said about slavery, the things that we've said about things punishable by death. Do you draw a conclusion? I mean, maybe if a person who had never seen the Bible before, that they might be able to see some fairness here? And where do you see where they might think that it's not fair? I think when things get a little bit extreme in the minds of people, if someone is an individual who says something bad about their parent, it dishonors them, that I think in our culture today, because there's not that much respect for parents generally, it's not something that's expected, that you show honor to your parents. I think some people would look at that and say, well, I don't know, that seems kind of strong to me. So I'm kind of understanding that from that angle. But what about some of these things we've talked about? Do they seem fair to you? If so, why? If not, why not? Yeah, James?
I think one issue when people look at the Old Testament or even the New Testament, when they look at God, is that even in terms of historical things, I always try to think of it, don't try to think of it from a 21st century or an
That's a good point.
perspective,
Yeah.
because whatever culture or society you live in, you're going to have a different mindset.
Sure.
Versus if you believe in God and you believe in the Bible, then there has to be this understanding that God is perfect
Sure.
and that His judgments are perfect,
Right.
and that
So that puts us in a place where we're ready to accept these things as fair. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
and so it would so what we would see as fair is different from how God sees. Even in Isaiah or Jeremiah, when God says to the children of Israel, "You call my ways unfair, but
Yeah.
are not my ways fair? And
Sure.
your ways are unfair."
Right.
And He also says, "Cursed are those who call good evil
Right.
and evil good."
Sure.
And
It's all in Isaiah. Yeah, it's
God
good.
says, "This is what's right," and you're saying it's wrong,
Sure.
and you're supporting things that are evil.
So it may not, our idea of fairness might, if we're not showing respect for God, we just might not think it's fair. Okay, but if we have trust in God, we know this is His word, even if it was for the people who lived under the law of Moses, still, we're just kind of looking at it from the point of view, would it be fair? Now what about the ox goring? Does that sound fair to you? If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. Well, there you go. Yeah, I can picture that. Yeah. Okay, but the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. Okay, so now here, if it happens, then it seems like that who gets punished is the ox, or well, it certainly wouldn't be a sheep. Okay, but what happens if the ox owner has some history with this? All right, and that's where this comes into, I think, helping me to understand that it's fair. Justin, go ahead and read while you're talking. Go ahead and read verse 29.
Sorry, I had my Bible still.
Okay.
29, you said?
Yes, of chapter 21. 21, verse 29.
Yeah. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, the owner shall be warned, but
That's it.
the owner has been warned, but has not kept it pinned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned, and the owner is to be put to death.
Okay.
However, if payment is demanded, and the owner may be redeem his life in payment of whatever is demanded.
Okay, so there's some options that are provided there, even if there's some sort of previous thing that's gone on, and it's why didn't you do anything about your ox? You should have kept him restrained. And he said, well, I don't care. People can do whatever you want, and it's my ox, and I'll do whatever I want. Well, okay, if that got out there that's what happened, then this person could have to experience some consequences. Now, does that seem fair? Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
Bringing it to our culture today, if a dog attacks a child, there are some liabilities. Sometimes that dog is actually put down.
Right. In fact, it's very common for that dog to be. Yeah.
And we've seen situations where the dog, is not put down, whatever the case may be, but it has a history of attacking people.
Yeah.
And now we see liability for the owner of that dog. So it kind of seems like it's kind of in the same category
Yeah.
as the bull goring.
Yeah, I don't think a person, even if that was my dog that killed someone in the law we have today, I don't think I'd be put to death. Not that I don't deserve it. I mean, under those circumstances, I'm just saying that when we look at this, I think there's a sense of fairness, and I think God's intending to be fair as he goes about this. Yeah, sometimes these things happen. But what if somehow you weren't doing your job, human being? Then you're going to be held accountable. All right, we're out of time. Thanks. We'll just go ahead and it's been kind of a fun discussion, so we'll go ahead and just save it till next week, and we'll finish this off next week. Thank you.